Busy couple of weeks ahead for the Prime Minister. Justin Trudeau is attending the G7 Leaders Summit in Italy next week, followed by the Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland. His focus will be the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine and combating foreign interference. Let's bring in Scott Reid, our CTV News political commentator. Scott, thanks as always for joining us.
Morning, Roger.
The G7 summit's kicking off. What will be the Prime Minister's priorities heading into that?
I think probably threefold. Obviously, the wars in Europe with Ukraine, the war in the Middle East with Gaza, I think will be the principal and most important and pressing issue for the G7 leaders. And you look at some of the invitees. So we've got, leaders from Jordan and from Saudi Arabia also, who I think their presence is all about the Middle East and trying to get some sort of breakthrough ceasefire. But then, as you mentioned, there'll be discussions of foreign interference. That's a huge domestic issue. The Prime Minister is not going to allow it to go untouched while on the world stage. And I would also say he has got to spend some time, along with President Biden, talking about economic renewal. We're starting to see interest rates come down. What more can be added to that? How can he send a message from the world stage with respect to economic renewal and strengthening of economic conditions at home and abroad? That's an important priority as well.
How does can Canada and U.S. have the same conversation about that? I mean, the U.S., it seems like their economy is going gangbusters. Ours is struggling a little more.
I think they have to have that kind of conversation because we have mutual interests with respect to trade. We have mutual interests, obviously, when it comes to interest rate. And we don't quite coordinate our interest rates. But even this week, you heard the governor of the Bank of Canada being asked, well, how far ahead can you get of the Fed? I mean, if they don't bring down rates because their economy perhaps doesn't need it as much, can you get out that much further ahead? Because, of course, that would negatively affect our dollar. So there will be discussions and there are certainly mutual interests. But, it takes us into another issue. You can't say the word trade, a G7 summit, United States and Canada, without thinking about the orange cloud that hovers over much of this. And that is the prospect that this could be the last G7 summit before they see the return of club member Donald Trump. And that's a harrowing prospect for all these G7 leaders. It has obvious interests for us, Canada, as their largest trade partner. But you think about the war in Ukraine. You think about the way in which Donald Trump has talked casually about shutting down supplies to Ukraine and permitting Putin to have his way. That is going to loom very, very heavily over these meetings also.
And with Canada, the G7, are we still being heard there? Is our voice being heard?
Oh, yeah, no question. I mean, the reality is, and you go through these stages where people say, well, we're seeing all NATO partners being pressed on paying dues and so forth. But the truth of the matter is that the G7 sets a tone and a direction for so much of these sort of global discussions. The art of summitry, the work that happens in advance and afterward, we participate in that as though we're equals. Every seat at the table is different when it comes to who speaks, but every seat at the table is equal when it comes to pressing on these matters and setting forth the agenda. So it absolutely matters. And I think it will particularly matter on economic issues.
And the summit coming up in Switzerland, what can we expect from that?
Well, that's going to be interesting to watch. I mean, Canada co-chairs two important working groups, one on POWs, the return of POWs, the other on the return of children. I think really what you're going to see, and President Zelensky, I should say, is going to be at the G7. You're going to see Canada again trying to marshal, trying to animate that international consensus in favor of Ukraine and against Russia. And the challenge is that no one at this point is in a position where they are returning POWs or children. There's very little interest in that from the state of Russia. So it's really going to be a question of using moral suasion, trying to use the bully pulpit, try to maintain momentum in favor of Ukraine, because the truth of the matter is the war in Ukraine is going very poorly right now. Russia is really making inroads. President Zelensky is almost pleading in his overtures to the West for direct use of military weapons, for some sort of help, because they are getting very, very pressed.
And just before we go, new Nanos poll showing support for Trudeau slipping further. What is that like for him going into these meetings, knowing these numbers are dropping at home?
I'm glad you asked that, because the politics of the summit are interesting too. I already mentioned the orange cloud that hovers over this of President Trump, but think about it. Rishi Sunak is there. He's in the middle of a UK election. Looks like he is just going to get absolutely clobbered by voters. Biden and Trudeau facing tough numbers at home, the prospect of elections. Trudeau a little further out. Biden's imminent this fall. So the notion of change also hovers over this summit. Electoral change, political change. And when you look at the polls that you just mentioned, it feeds into the constant dialogue we have here in Canada about whether or not the Prime Minister is going to step down at some point before the next election. So that raises the obvious question. I'm sure he'll be asked, might this be his last summit as a G7 leader? We just don't know the answer to that, but I'm positive he'll be asked it.
Okay. Scott, thank you as always for your analysis.
Thanks, Roger.